I've always been drawn to the deep forest, the kind that swallows sunlight and muffles the sounds of the outside world. There's something about the way the trees crowd together, their thick bark and tangled roots making it feel like you've stepped into another realm, far removed from the noise and chaos of everyday life. On weekends, I'd escape the city and head for those remote woodland areas, places where the only company is the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the call of a distant bird. The air there is cooler, heavier, and the silence feels almost sacred. But there's also a weight to it, a quiet that's more than just peaceful. It's the kind of silence that presses against your skin, warning you that you're not alone. One trail in particular has always fascinated me. It's a winding path that cuts through an ancient forest, known among locals for its eerie quietness and the thick canopy that blocks out most of the daylight. The trail has a reputation, too, stories passed down from hikers and old-timers about people who vanished without a trace while walking those woods. Some say it's cursed ground, others speak of strange shadows moving just beyond the edge of vision. But for me, those legends only deepen the draw. I'd heard whispers about disappearances, about nightmarish encounters, but I never thought I'd witness anything myself, until that late afternoon when everything changed. I remember setting out just as the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, leaves crunching underfoot, the distant hum of insects, but there was an undercurrent of something unfamiliar. As I moved deeper onto the trail, the light dimmed sharply, swallowed by the dense canopy overhead. The usual warmth of the afternoon faded into a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, a nagging feeling crawling up my spine that I wasn't just being cautious. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. Strange sounds began to echo through the trees, low, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually growing clearer. It wasn't the rustle of animals or the whistle of wind through the branches. It was something else, something deliberate. A repetitive tapping, like fingernails on bark, or footsteps that didn't quite match my own. I stopped, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The noises fell silent, as if the forest had swallowed them whole again. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, that the legends had gotten under my skin. But the shadows were shifting in ways they shouldn't, bending and twisting just beyond the reach of the fading light. That night, back at my cabin on the edge of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had eyes, watching, waiting. I started talking to other hikers and locals, people who'd spent years exploring those wild areas. Their stories were chilling, each one more unsettling than the last. There was the man who swore he'd seen figures standing motionless among the trees, their eyes reflecting an unnatural glow. A woman who'd heard whispers in the dark, voices that called her name from places no one else could reach. A group of campers who'd found strange symbols carved into the bark around their campsite, signs that vanished by morning as if erased by some unseen hand. I realized that the forest was more than just a place of quiet beauty, it was a place where something dark and unknowable lurked beneath the surface. Gathering these true horror stories became an obsession. I wanted to understand what was happening out there, to piece together the fragments of fear and mystery that clung to the woods like morning mist. Each tale added a new layer to the strange mosaic of the forest's secrets, and as I listened, I could feel the chill of those stories seeping into my own skin. One afternoon, I set out again, determined to see for myself what the forest really held. The trail was shrouded in an unnatural gloom, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The thick canopy blocked out the sun, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked, I noticed how the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if swallowed by the shadows themselves. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the path narrowing until it felt like I was walking through a tunnel of twisting branches and gnarled roots. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the presence of something watching, something waiting just beyond the edge of sight. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from seeing a bear or hearing a wolf howl, it was something older, colder. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of meaning. I caught glimpses of movement, shapes shifting between trees, too quick to be animals but too deliberate to be tricks of the light. The forest seemed alive with secrets, and I was both terrified and compelled to uncover them. That hike left me restless, unable to sleep. The stories I'd heard weren't just tales, they were warnings. The forest was a place where the veil between the ordinary and the unknown was thin, and sometimes, it was easy to slip through. I began to record what I heard from others, piecing together their experiences to form a clearer picture of what lurked in those woods. There were patterns, the silent figures, the eerie noises, the sudden disappearances. Each account added to the growing sense that the forest was a realm unto itself, governed by rules that defied logic. I'm still drawn back there, weekend after weekend, despite the unease that settles in my gut whenever I step onto the trail. The forest calls to me, with its dense shadows and whispered secrets. I keep going, hoping to understand what lies beneath the surface, to find the truth behind the stories. But every time I return, I'm reminded that some mysteries are meant to stay buried, and that the forest holds its own kind of darkness, one that watches patiently, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into its depths. One late afternoon, not long after that unsettling hike, I met a man named Marcus at a local diner near the edge of the forest. He was a regular, someone who worked as a park ranger during the week but spent his weekends hiking the trails that most people avoided. When I mentioned the forest and its strange reputation, his face tightened in a way that told me he'd seen things I wouldn't forget. He hesitated at first, then leaned in, voice low and steady as he shared an encounter that chilled me to my core. Marcus had been hiking alone, taking a less traveled path deep within the forest, one that wrapped around a dense thicket where the trees grew so close together the sunlight barely touched the ground. As he moved slowly, he noticed a figure standing among the trees. At first, he thought it was another hiker, but the figure was oddly still, too still. There was no shifting weight, no sign of breathing or movement, just a rigid silhouette framed by the dimming light. What caught Marcus's attention most was the figure's eyes, pale and unblinking, reflecting the last rays of sunlight like twin mirrors. He stopped, heart thudding, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't blink, didn't move. It was as if it was carved out of the shadows themselves, pale skin blending seamlessly with the mist that had begun to drift in between the trunks. Marcus called out softly, but the figure remained motionless, its gaze fixed on him with an unnatural intensity that made his skin crawl. When he took a cautious step forward, the figure seemed to dissolve into the fog, vanishing without a sound or trace. The encounter left Marcus shaken. He told me about that crushing sense of dread that filled the space where the figure had stood, an emptiness that reached into his chest and squeezed tight. The forest's atmosphere shifted instantly, from peaceful to threatening, as if the trees themselves had turned against him. He said the silence that followed was so complete it was deafening, like the world had been muted just to make room for that terrible presence. Marcus hurried back to the trailhead, his pace quickening with every step, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Even after he reached his truck and locked the doors, the image of those unblinking eyes haunted him. He confessed he didn't tell many people about what happened, fearing disbelief or ridicule, but he was certain the figure was not human, or at least not any human he'd ever known. I listened, fascinated and unnerved. His story was the first real proof I had that the forest was home to something otherworldly, something that didn't just hide in the shadows but actively observed those who dared to enter its depths. There was an overwhelming sense that the figure wasn't just a ghost or a trick of light, but a sentinel of the forest's darker secrets. Another story came from a woman named Lydia, who preferred to hike alone for the solitude but had a habit of sharing her experiences with me whenever we crossed paths. She once described an afternoon when she was carefully following a narrow trail lined with moss-covered stones and twisted roots. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so, and as she moved forward, she caught sight of a figure standing motionless between the trees, just like Marcus had described. What struck Lydia was how the figure seemed to blur at the edges, like it wasn't fully part of this world. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it didn't shift or breathe. Its eyes were wide open, staring with an unblinking intensity that made Lydia's stomach drop. She said it felt like the figure was both there and not there, a ghostly presence barely anchored to the forest floor. Lydia tried to approach, curiosity battling with rising fear, but as she stepped closer, the figure dissolved into the thickening mist. She felt an icy chill wash over her, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The forest seemed to close in tighter around her, the canopy above thickening until the sunlight was a distant memory. She turned and hurried back along the trail, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and terror. Both Marcus and Lydia described that moment when the forest's peacefulness turned hostile, as if an unseen boundary had been crossed. The trees, which moments before seemed like silent protectors, became looming sentinels watching every movement with cold indifference. The stillness of the figure and its sudden disappearance left a void, a presence that couldn't be seen but was felt keenly, like something waiting, watching, and judging. It wasn't just the appearance of the figure that unnerved them, but the way the forest itself seemed to react. The air grew heavier, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves ceased, and a chilling silence took hold. That silence was oppressive, pressing down with a tangible weight, as if the forest was warning them to leave. Both hikers felt an overwhelming urge to escape, as if their very survival depended on it. I started to notice a pattern in these accounts. The figures always appeared at the edge of visibility, pale and motionless with eyes wide open, blending into the mist or shadows. They never spoke or moved, but their presence was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. Approaching them was impossible. They vanished before contact, leaving behind only the echo of fear and the silence of the forest. These stories changed how I viewed the forest. It wasn't just a place of natural beauty or ancient trees, but a realm where the boundary between the living and the unknown was blurred. The figures seemed less like individuals and more like manifestations of the forest's will, guardians of its secrets or perhaps warnings to those who wandered too far. The more I collected these accounts, the more I understood that the forest held a power beyond human comprehension. It wasn't malevolent in a traditional sense, but indifferent and enigmatic, a force that could inspire awe and terror in equal measure. The silent figures were a reminder that some parts of the world are governed by rules we cannot see or understand, and crossing into those realms comes at a price. After hearing Marcus and Lydia's stories, I decided to push further, to seek out the places where these figures had been seen. I returned to the trail Marcus had described, walking slowly and listening for any sign of the unnatural silence or the faintest glimmer of those unblinking eyes. The forest was still and quiet, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. I felt the familiar chill, the weight of unseen eyes tracking my movements, but there was no figure to be found, only the whisper of leaves and the steady rhythm of my own breath. That night, lying awake in my cabin, I replayed their stories in my mind, feeling the same dread they described. The forest's silence wasn't empty, it was filled with presence, with watchers who chose to reveal themselves only to those who dared to look. And I knew, deep down, that the forest's secrets were far from fully uncovered. A few weeks after hearing Marcus and Lydia's stories, I found myself talking with a camper named Jenna who had an experience that made my skin crawl in a whole new way. She'd spent a weekend camping alone in a remote part of the forest, far from marked trails, near a clearing where the trees thinned out and the sky was visible in patches. Jenna was an experienced outdoorswoman, confident in her ability to navigate and survive in the wilderness. But what happened to her that dusk was something she described as pure terror, a nightmare that still haunted her days later. Jenna told me she was sitting by her campfire late in the afternoon, the fading light casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest was unusually quiet, the usual background noise of birds and insects absent. She noticed footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the edge of the trees. At first, she thought it might be a hiker or a curious animal, but as the footsteps grew louder, she realized they were following her. Her pulse quickened. She stood up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The footsteps didn't stop, they matched her pace as she moved toward her tent, quickening when she did. The sense of being chased settled over her like a cold weight. She started running, breaking into a full sprint through the underbrush, branches slapping her arms and legs. The footsteps behind her seemed to speed up, closing the gap despite the obstacles. Jenna described how panic overtook her senses. The forest around her twisted and blurred as she darted between trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, as if something was right there, just out of sight but impossibly close. The snapping of branches and rustling leaves were deafening in the silence, and she stumbled into a small clearing, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. In that clearing, Jenna realized she wasn't just being followed, she was being circled. The footsteps stood still for a moment, then began moving around the perimeter, always just out of reach, keeping her trapped inside. She scanned the edges desperately but saw nothing, only the darkening forest closing in around her. Her mind raced, terror twisting her thoughts as she struggled to find a way out. With trembling hands, Jenna tore through the undergrowth toward where she knew her car was parked several hundred yards away. The footsteps resumed their pursuit, relentless and measured, never breaking the rhythm. She dared a glance behind and saw nothing, but the feeling of eyes watching her was overwhelming. The clearing felt like a trap, a cage made of shadows and silence. Finally, she burst through the last line of trees and into the small gravel parking area. Her car was there, headlights off and doors locked. She fumbled with her keys, hands shaking violently, and tossed herself inside. As she locked the doors, the footsteps stopped abruptly at the tree line. Jenna sat in the dark, shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The forest outside was still, but the weight of the unseen presence lingered. Jenna's story was different from the silent figures Marcus and Lydia had described. but it shared the same oppressive feeling of being stalked by something not quite human or natural. It was as if the forest itself had decided she was no longer welcome, and whatever was out there was enforcing that boundary. Her terror was raw and palpable, a stark contrast to the eerie calm of the earlier encounters. I asked Jenna if she thought it was some kind of animal or person, but she was certain it was neither. The footsteps were too deliberate, too synchronized with her movements to be random. She described the cold breath she felt on her neck as something unnatural, too cold, almost like a presence rather than wind. The way the footsteps circled her, never revealing themselves, made her believe she had been hunted by something intelligent, something that wanted to instill fear rather than cause physical harm. That night, Jenna barely slept, keeping the car doors locked and the engine running. The forest seemed to press against the windows, the shadows outside shifting and pulsing with unseen life. In the weeks that followed, she avoided the woods entirely, shaken by the memory of the chase and the inexplicable presence that had pursued her. Hearing Jenna's account added a new layer to my understanding of the forest's dangers. It wasn't just about silent watchers or mysterious figures, it was also a place that could turn predator, where the line between hunter and hunted blurred. The forest seemed to have a will of its own, capable of deciding who belonged and who didn't, and it could act with terrifying intent. I began to see the forest as a living entity, not merely a collection of trees and wildlife, but something that could sense fear and respond to it. The footsteps that followed Jenna were like echoes of that will, manifestations of an ancient force enforcing a boundary invisible to the human eye. I wondered how many others had fled those woods, never speaking of what they'd encountered, their stories swallowed by the same silence that filled the forest itself. Determined to learn more, I returned to the clearing Jenna had described, visiting late in the afternoon as the shadows lengthened. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the forest around me was unnervingly quiet. I could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes, the brush of a presence just beyond sight. The clearing felt smaller than I imagined, enclosed by towering trees whose branches entwined like fingers, blocking out the fading sunlight. As I stood there, listening, the silence was broken by a faint snapping of twigs from the edge of the trees. My heart jumped. I spun around, but the forest was empty, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. My breath caught in my throat as I felt a cold draft brush past me, carrying the faintest hint of a whisper, like a warning carried on the wind. I stepped back, realizing how easy it was to become trapped in the forest's embrace, how quickly the calm could turn to dread. That night, I pored over the stories I'd collected, trying to piece together the forest's patterns. What was it about the clearing that made it a hunting ground? Why did the footsteps follow Jenna so precisely? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear, the forest was far from a passive landscape. It was alive, aware, and capable of enacting its own form of justice on those who crossed its hidden thresholds. Each of these encounters peeled back another layer of the forest's mystery, revealing a place where fear was both a warning and a weapon. The chasing footsteps were a reminder that sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you feel creeping just behind you, always there, waiting, patient, and ready to close in the moment you falter. A few nights after hearing Jenna's terrifying account, I met a group of friends at a small roadside cafe just outside the forest. They were a tight-knit bunch who'd decided to spend a weekend camping near a remote lake deep within the woods. Their trip had started as a fun escape from the city's noise, but what they experienced left them shaken, and their story added a new dimension of unease to everything I'd been gathering. The friends, 3 men and 2 women, had pitched their tents in a clearing surrounded by towering, ancient trees. The lake was quiet, its glassy surface reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. At first, their weekend was peaceful, filled with laughter and the crackling of campfires. But on the second night, things took a strange turn. They woke to find strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding their campsite, deep, precise marks arranged in patterns none of them recognized. The carvings looked old, weathered by time, but fresh enough to have been made very recently. The friends were unnerved but tried to dismiss it as the work of pranksters or local kids. Still, the symbols seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if they were warnings etched into the bark. That night, whispers drifted through the trees, faint but distinct voices speaking just beyond hearing. The friends swore the whispers called their names, soft and coaxing, echoing between the trunks. When they strained to listen, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the forest. Footsteps followed the whispers, slow, deliberate, circling their camp in the darkness but never breaking into the clearing. One of the women, Megan, disappeared briefly around midnight. She told the others she'd gone to explore the edge of the lake, but no one saw her leave or return. When she reappeared, she was pale, shaking, and couldn't explain where she'd been or what she'd seen. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, as if she'd encountered something that defied explanation. The group huddled together, panic rising, and they decided to pack up and leave immediately. As they hurried through the dark forest, the sense of being watched never left them. Twigs snapped behind them, shadows flickered just beyond their vision, and the strange symbols seemed to follow them, etched into the trees lining their path as if marking their escape route. The friends felt the forest closing in, as if it were a living thing intent on keeping them trapped. They reached the edge of the woods breathless and terrified, but even then, the feeling of eyes tracking them lingered. The symbols and the whispers had left an indelible mark on their minds, a reminder that the forest held secrets darker than they could have imagined. They refused to return, their experience a stark warning to anyone who might venture too deep. Listening to them, I realized the forest's danger wasn't limited to silent watchers or unseen chasers. It was a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural blurred, where symbols carved in bark carried power, and where the very trees seemed alive with intent. The whispers were not just sounds but invitations or threats, voices from a realm just beyond human perception. I asked about the carvings, and the friends described them as intricate, almost ritualistic, circles intertwined with lines and shapes that resembled ancient runes. None of them had seen anything like it before, and they all agreed the marks felt hostile, as if the forest itself was warning them to stay away. The disappearance and sudden return of Megan added to the mystery, suggesting the forest could reach out and pull someone into its depths, only to release them changed. Their story made me think about the forest as a place of shifting realities, where time and space didn't behave as expected. The idea that one could vanish and reappear without memory was terrifying, hinting at forces that toyed with human perception. The friends' panic and urgency to escape underscored the palpable threat lurking beneath the forest's surface. Determined to understand more, I returned to the lake clearing during the day, hoping to find traces of the symbols. The trees were ancient, their bark rough and scarred, but I spotted faint carvings similar to those described, worn down but still visible to the keen eye. The patterns seemed to pulse beneath the surface, as if alive with a hidden energy. There was an overwhelming sense that I was being watched, a feeling that only intensified as the sunlight faded. I spent hours circling the area, listening for whispers or signs of movement, but the forest remained silent. Still, the atmosphere was charged with something unseen, a tension that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I realized the friends' experience was not an isolated incident but part of a larger tapestry of strange encounters woven throughout the forest. That night, as I lay in my cabin, I couldn't shake the images of the carved symbols or the friends' terrified faces. The forest's power seemed to extend beyond physical threats, it was psychological, spiritual, and deeply unsettling. The whispers and disappearances suggested a realm where human rules no longer applied, where the forest held dominion over those who entered its heart. I began to wonder about the origin of the symbols and the whispers. Were they remnants of some ancient ritual, left by those who once sought to control or appease the forest's darker forces? Or were they warnings left by the forest itself, a living entity marking its boundaries and punishing those who crossed them? The answers eluded me, buried beneath layers of fear and mystery. The friend's story also made me question how many others had encountered these phenomena and chosen silence over sharing. The forest's reputation was growing, but much of what happened remained hidden in whispered conversations and late-night confessions. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and crossing it came with consequences no one fully understood. As the days passed, I found myself drawn back to that lake clearing, compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for hiking or exploration, it was a place charged with a dark energy that defied explanation. The symbols, the whispers, and the disappearance all pointed to a truth too unsettling to ignore. I knew I had to keep digging, to uncover the forest's secrets before they claimed more victims. But with every new story, the sense of danger grew stronger, and I realized that some parts of the forest were better left unexplored. The friends' experience was a stark reminder that the forest was not just a collection of trees and wildlife, it was a living, breathing entity with its own rules, its own will, and a darkness that waited patiently in the shadows. Late one foggy morning, I met a hunter named Sam who had a story that added a whole new dimension to the forest's dark reputation. Sam was a seasoned outdoorsman, someone who had spent years tracking game and living off the land. But what he encountered deep in the woods near an abandoned cabin was unlike anything he'd ever faced, a grotesque presence that turned his experience into a desperate fight for survival. Sam had set out before dawn, intent on hunting deer near a remote area that locals rarely visited. The cabin he passed was long deserted, its wood rotting and windows shattered, swallowed by vines and moss. As he moved cautiously through the underbrush, he caught a glimpse of something unusual near the cabin, a figure crouched low, its shape distorted and unnatural. The moment their eyes met, Sam froze. The creature was hideous, limbs twisted at impossible angles, skin stretched tight over bones in ways that defied anatomy, and eyes glowing with a sickly, unearthly light. It didn't look human, it looked like a nightmare given flesh, something warped by some ancient evil that had claimed the forest as its domain. Sam described its movements as jerky and unsettling, a blend of animalistic twitching and eerie fluidity that made his skin crawl. He tried to stay calm, backing slowly away, but the creature noticed and let out a guttural sound that echoed through the trees, a noise that froze the blood in his veins. Panic surged through Sam as the creature lunged toward him, claws scraping against the bark as he scrambled to evade it. He ran blindly, branches slapping his face and snagging his clothes, heart pounding as he fought to put distance between himself and the monstrous being. The chase felt endless. The creature pursued relentlessly, its glowing eyes never leaving him, its snarls reverberating through the forest. Sam stumbled into a thicket, turning to face the creature, weapon raised but trembling in his hands. The creature hesitated for a moment, as if studying him, then vanished into the shadows with a final, bone-chilling growl. Sam didn't stop running until he reached his truck parked miles away. He locked himself inside, hands shaking, unable to comprehend what he had just faced. Even then, he felt the creature's presence lingering outside, its glowing eyes watching from the darkness. Over the next few days, strange things happened around the cabin, footprints appearing in the dirt that didn't match any animal, eerie sounds echoing at night, and a feeling of being watched that no one else could explain. His story was a stark reminder that the forest's mysteries were not just silent figures or unseen chases, but tangible horrors that could confront you face to face. The grotesque creature embodied the forest's darkest side, a realm where natural laws bent and twisted, and where something ancient and malevolent roamed freely. As I listened to Sam, I thought about the common threads weaving through all these stories: isolation, fear, and an overwhelming sense of the unknown. Each encounter revealed a different facet of the forest's many dangers, but all shared the same chilling essence, a place where the veil between reality and nightmare thinned until they became indistinguishable. I visited the abandoned cabin days later, the air around it thick with silence and decay. The rotten wood creaked underfoot, and the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the edges of my vision. I found strange footprints in the mud, elongated and misshapen, unlike anything made by animals or humans. The forest hummed with an unseen energy, a reminder that the creature was not a one-time apparition but a resident of these woods, stalking its domain. That night, lying awake in my cabin, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes or the memory of Sam's desperate flight. The forest was alive with things that defied explanation, things that watched, waited, and sometimes hunted. The true horror wasn't just the creatures or the strange phenomena, but the knowledge that these forests harbor secrets far beyond our understanding. These stories have stayed with me, each one a thread in a tapestry of fear and fascination. They warn of a place where silence can be deadly, where shadows conceal more than just darkness, and where the line between the natural world and something far more sinister blurs. The forest is a realm unto itself, governed by forces that humans can neither see nor control, and it holds its secrets close, waiting for the next visitor to wander too deep into its depths.